بكت عيني بكت عيني بكت عيني على ذنبي وما لاقيت من كربي فيا ذلي ويا خجلي إذا ما قال لي ربي أما استحييته تعصيني ولا تخشى من العتب.
Today, inshallah, let's do something light and different, inshallah. And this is impromptu, so if I make some mistakes, I apologize to the viewers online. You can correct me historically. It's a bit of a history. As you all know, I have some passions in academics. One of them is history. And I wanted to, bring up a topic I was reading about recently, and that is a very important chapter in the history of Islam in America, here in America. Who is the first da'i, the first preacher that came to this country to preach Islam? Most likely nobody would know his name. You know his name? What is his name? His name is Sati Majid. Sati Majid. Sati Muhammad Majid. And he came to this land in 1904. This is, from our best knowledge that we have, the first person who came specifically to give da'wah, Islamic da'wah, to the people of North America. And even though his name is long forgotten, even many Muslims involved in activism are not aware of this person. And also because documents are so difficult to find of that era, and there was no internet, there was no social media, it's very difficult to piece together. So it's been one of my passions to read about these types of things, and because I feel myself basically following in that line, like this is the first domino. We are now, some of his groundwork that he has done, we'll get there. So it's very important to study this, understandably, right? The first person to come and preach mainstream Islam. Who was this person? What do we know about him? He was born in Sudan, and as a young man, he was eager. He had trained as local Shaykh, local scholar, memorized the Quran. Then he tried to study at Al-Azhar. For whatever reason, he didn't get acceptance. He became a sailor. And at that time, Sudan and Egypt are both British protectorates. So he joined the British Navy and he came to England, and eventually, somehow, he made his way to America. And he came to these shores in 1904, right? So 125 years ago. And some of what he did laid the foundations for what we see to this day, even though he is long gone. We're trying to piece together, as I said, he was active in Philadelphia, he was active in New York, he was active in Michigan, and in other cities as well, Chicago as well. And he was the first person to try to form a national institute or a national umbrella organization. You know, we now have, mashallah, so many national organizations. Who's the first person to really try to link the Muslims together, various cities? It was Sati Majid. And he formed, we don't even know the name of it because we have different names, the Islamic Federation Association, the Islamic Benevolence Society, the Islamic Charitable Association. Various names were given. We have them in various documents. Perhaps sometimes he didn't even officially file. But what he did was he got the Muslims of every community. We know, for example, one of the main things that he did in Michigan, he was the one who first purchased the first Muslim graveyard of all of America that we know of, official graveyard. As for unofficial graveyard, as we know, there were many enslaved people that were brought here as Muslims. No doubt there are buried places around this country. That's an unofficial graveyard. What's the first official graveyard where somebody purchased land and said this is going to be a Muslim graveyard? That is in Dearborn or Detroit. I don't know exactly the city, but basically in that city, in that area of Michigan. And who purchased it? Sati Majid was the one who gathered the funds from the people, and he purchased it, and 593 spots, I think, were assigned at that time. Now, why Michigan? What's going on in Michigan? And by the way, any of you that's been to Michigan, you know Dearborn, Michigan is the Arab capital of the world, right? You find signs in Arabic, actually street signs in Arabic. More than half the population is Arab descent. Why? What happened? Why is Sati Majid in Michigan as well? Well, one of the most richest people at the time was Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Corporation, and his factory was in Michigan. And he was the one who hired tens of thousands of Ottoman Arabs, of course the Ottoman Empire is at the time, 1890 onwards. He imported them basically. He brought in lots of laborers to work in his factory. Why did he bring in Arabs? Why did he bring in people from this region? Because he found them to be honest and working good hours, and the most important thing, not getting drunk. So he preferred to hire, and he's the one who gave tens of thousands of visas back in that day so that manual laborers, workers come. Now, the Arabs of that region, this is now Palestine, Lebanon, Syria in particular, Ottoman Levant as they called it back then. There were many Shia, many Sunni, many Duruz. And that's the people that came. But at that time, they didn't care about these sectarian differences. They did not build a masjid at that time. They were laborers, they're not ulama, they're not mashayikh, they're people coming for rizq, for money, right? So Sati Majid comes and he brings them together and he forms a nadi, an association, and he starts, campaigning, he starts to create some safe space for them. Same thing in New York, same thing in Chicago. And he took charge, he actually, he perhaps felt ambitious, and inshallah, and he has good intention. He started calling himself, don't laugh guys, it's true, Shaykh al-Islam fi America, okay? He called himself Shaykh al-Islam fi America. So this is the first Shaykh al-Islam that we had in America. And inshallah, he's sincere. The point is you have to realize it's a different time and place, right? He's trying to do something for the ummah. And whatever he's doing, perhaps these titles helped at that time. People are going to trust him, whatever it might be. Also, of the things that he did is that he began preaching and teaching Islam to many of the Muslims who had left practicing Islam. You have to realize that the first batch that came here voluntarily, generally speaking, they weren't the religious types, right? Knowing they're going to leave Muslim lands, going to a strange land where there are no mosques, no Muslims, right? You understand these were people in circumstances difficult. The priority is not the deen. So, in fact, surveys, I read a PhD that was done back in the 50s. They had a survey of how many Arabs in Chicago, because at that time there were no Pakistani desis in the 50s. Right now Chicago is, mashallah, Chicago Sharif. Back then it wasn't Chicago Sharif. You guys didn't get the joke, the Arabs here. It was Hyderabad these days. But anyway, back then it was majority Arab population in that region. And a survey was done. What percentage are actually fasting Ramadan? I forgot the statistic, but it was like 10%, right? You have to understand, there were no mashayikh, there were no ulama, there were no masajid. It's just an informal survey that they did in that time. So this is a different era. People like Sati Majid come and they are giving basic street da'wah, we call it, okay? And they're just trying to help the Muslims in whatever way they can. One of the things that we have recorded as well is that he would actually take on the social problems of the Muslim community. So for example, again, England at that time was still a colonial power. England controlled so many different lands, India and Yemen, and it so happened that there were a large group of sailors who had been hired by the British to work in their navies from Yemen and from India. And when the ship came to America, they were left stranded without pay. Maybe dozens of sailors, and they were literally starving, no pay, they're brown skinned, they cannot work. You know how it was back then, right? Very different. So Sati Majid wrote a letter, we have the letter preserved. He wrote it to the High Consulate of England, right? And he is saying that these are your servants, they came on your paycheck, it is your obligation to take charge, and he wrote a very, adab, very well, perfect grammar, everything, and he's taking on, he goes, and I am there, the Reverend Sati Majid. The Reverend is the Shaykh. I'm their Reverend, Sati Majid. So he's taking charge of this community. Also of the things that he did, he is the first da'i or preacher to challenge the non-mainstream movements that became common at that time. Now this is a chapter of history that perhaps some of you are not aware, but you should be aware of this. During this time frame, we're talking about 1900, 1910, 1920, a number of, we call them pseudo-Islamic movements had sprung forth. Specifically two very bizarre movements. The first of them was founded by somebody who called himself Noble Drew Ali. Noble Drew Ali. And this movement was called the Moorish Science Temple. Moor means Muslim. The Moorish Science Temple. And this Noble Drew Ali said he is the Prophet of Allah. And this Noble Drew Ali wrote a book called The Holy Quran of Noble Drew Ali. It's available on Amazon, you can buy it, or you can available at libraries. Obviously, there's nothing to do with Islam. You will see the term Mecca, you will see the term Quran, you will see the term Muhammad, but ideas, theology, aqidah, nothing. So Sati Majid was the first person to start saying, hey, this person and this movement has nothing to do with real Islam. And after this, another movement came that became much more popular, and that is the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam had its own trajectory, but this is right after Sati Majid. So Sati Majid began preaching against the version of quote-unquote Islam that Noble Drew Ali is preaching. It's nothing to do with Islam. And along with this, ironically, and this is something of interest to many of you from a particular region, a particular da'i came by the name of Mufti Sadiq Muhammad is his name. And he was sent by Mirza Ghulam Ahmad's community. He was perhaps the second da'i sent to preach his version of Islam. Obviously, his version of Islam is not our version of Islam. And he landed here in the 1920s. When he landed, by the way, the government stopped him and jailed him for 7 weeks. And they said, we're not going to let you into this country. Why? Because you preach a religion that preaches polygamy. So we're not going to let you in. So Mufti Sadiq said, no, our version of Islam doesn't preach this. So he was allowed in. So Mufti Sadiq then also began going and calling people to his version, which is of course Ahmadi or Qadiani Islam, as you know. So that's not, we don't consider them to be within our fold as we know. But he began preaching. And again, Sati Majid, when he finds out the theology, he's like, no, these people aren't, these people aren't rightly guided. Mufti Sadiq was one of the people who founded the first masjid in Chicago, mainstream masjid, until people found out, hey, this person isn't mainstream. So then they kicked him out, right? So we have all of these things going on. This is 1920, 1910. This is 100 years ago. All of this is happening in this country. These, issues and debates, people are not aware of what's going on. And in order to solidify his position, Sati Majid said, I need to get fatwas against these weirdos. So in 1929, he left America after having been here for 25 years and having done all of this that we know of here and there. He left America to go back to Al-Azhar and to get fatwas against these groups so that he can now tell the people, hey, these people don't represent Islam. Islam is what I am telling you, mainstream Islam, Quran and Sunnah and whatnot. And he got fatwas from the chief of Al-Azhar. From Al-Azhar, we have an official fatwa. I think it's dated 1929, 1930. We have it. The Arabic, I read it myself. By the chief of the Mashaykh of Al-Azhar and the Grand Mufti of Sudan and the Grand Mufti of other regions that he visited. All of them are saying the same thing, that anybody who says they are a prophet, they are not a Muslim. There is no Quran other than the Quran we recite. These are heretical groups. He wanted to get funds to come back to America. For whatever reason, he wasn't able to do that. In fact, the Mufti of Al-Azhar, Shaykh Maraghi Mustafa, well known, he actually has an internal memo that says that Sati seems to be a good person, but he's not qualified to be a Shaykh. He's not qualified that we can endorse him. He hasn't had formal training. So because of this, he wasn't able to get money, because he wanted to be officially appointed to be Shaykh al-Islam in America. He wanted to be appointed that I'm the one being sent. He wasn't able to get that. He didn't get the money to come back. And so he eventually retired back to Sudan and he died around 1960. But he still corresponded with the Muslims that were, some of the Muslims had converted and some of the communities he corresponded. We have those letters. One of his main students then took on the banner of Sunni Islam when there was no banner of Sunni Islam. And that student is a name, again, most people aren't familiar with, but he should be somebody that should be a household name. Anybody who studies American Islam's history, they should know this name. And that is Shaykh Dawud Faisal of New York. Shaykh Dawud Faisal, who died 1980. So look how recent we're getting, okay? Shaykh Dawud Faisal converted at the hands of Sati Majid. He was an African-American, actually he was Afro-Caribbean, but African-American, came here and converted to Islam, mainstream Sunni Islam, not these Nation of Islam and these Noble Drew Ali, whatnot, no, mainstream Islam he converted. And Dawud Faisal was the only indigenous African-American voice that is preaching Quran and Sunnah. When the other voices were preaching that Elijah Muhammad is the Prophet of God, Noble Drew Ali is this Quran. The only person who was preaching mainstream Islam from within, the indigenous is Imam Dawud Faisal. Imam Dawud Faisal interacted with Malcolm X multiple times, had an impact on Malcolm X as well. This is that generation, Imam Dawud Faisal. And his students are still, some of them that know him, they are still alive, but they're very elderly now, really small communities. Point being, these are very important chapters, very important lessons for us to learn. That subhanAllah, these small, seeds that Sati Majid planted 100 years ago, 1922 if I'm not mistaken, was when he formed the first Federation of Islamic whatever in North America. I forgot what it was called. 1922. The first time he's thinking of forming something national. Subhanallah, he never imagined that from now to now. How many Muslims were in America in 1920? We don't know for sure. But there are estimates that say perhaps there were around 60,000 Muslims. That's a huge number if you think about it. 60,000 Muslims across multiple states, primarily concentrated in Michigan and in New York and in Idaho and in Philadelphia and Chicago. And the main ethnicities of those Muslims, the number one ethnicity were from the Levant, the Ottoman Empire, what is now Bilad al-Sham, because of a certain financial crisis that took place. They needed to find rizq and money, so there was mass exodus from that region. Number two, by the way, nobody can guess. Who would guess one of the largest ethnicities of Muslims back in 1910, 1920? From where? Who can guess? There was no Bosnia. Close. Albania, that region. The second largest is Albanian, because the communists had taken over, because there were things happening over there. So there was mass exodus from that region to find safety. So the first masjid in New York was actually the Albanian masjid. Can you believe? Subhanallah, right? And Sati Majid visited that masjid and helped that masjid out as well. So we had a large group of Albanians as well. And then Pakistanis. Any Pakistanis? 1910, were there any Pakistanis? Guys, there was no Pakistan in 1910. Were there Indians? Yes, there were Indians here. There were Indian, what we would call Indian speaking Urdu, Indians from other backgrounds, Indians, that region is all India, Bangla speaking Indians, yes, there were. And there were pockets that we are well aware of that they came here and they, married, generally speaking, outside of the faith, and their children kept Islamic names but lost the identity there. Once in a while you pop up a documentary, you see an interesting fact about some Muslim name, 80 years old, but they're not Muslim, or they know that they're Muslim but they don't practice Islam. There was a documentary about someone in Nevada as well, by the way, who had a burger joint, a Muslim who had a burger joint, and now his kids and whatnot, they're all Muslim name. So we have these interesting anecdotes and tidbits. What happened? To this we conclude. 1917, America shut its door for further immigration. 1917, they passed what is called the Yellow Act. And the Yellow Act banned anybody who was yellow and brown and black. They called it the Yellow Act. It was meant to ban Chinese in particular. But they're so racist, they ended up banning everybody except people from Ireland and Germany, basically, or Italy, right? So if your skin color was, literally, I'm not making this up, you can look it up. In 1917, they banned any immigrants except if you have a lot of conditions and you're highly qualified and this and that, until 1963 when Ted Kennedy repealed the ban. So from 1917 to 1963, Muslim immigration trickled to almost nothing. And that's one of the reasons why the indigenous pseudo-American Muslim movements flourished, because there wasn't mainstream Islam. There wasn't many people, you had the people who came and their children, but compared to the indigenous movements that were here, the Nation of Islam at its peak numbered 1 million people. 1 million compared to 50, 60,000 of mainstream Sunnism. Look at the difference, right? And the Nation of Islam had very bizarre beliefs when finally, eventually, the son Waduddin Muhammad, may Allah Azza wa Jal forgive him and bless him, he did an amazing thing. Waduddin Muhammad, he, by Allah's blessings and grace, brought his community back into mainstream Islam. He's the son of Elijah Muhammad. He's the one who interacted with Malcolm X and secretly was Sunni, and his father appointed him, and some say he appointed him knowing that he was Sunni, and Allah knows best. West. And then slowly but surely, as soon as his father died, he began the changes to bring his community into mainstream Islam. We thank Allah for what he has done, and he has inshallah ta'ala earned Jannah for that. In any case, this was an interesting episode in American Islamic history, and it is a history that every one of you is connected to, so you should also be aware of this. And you can find more about this person. You can Google the name and look up some articles, Imam Sati Majid and also Imam Dawud Faisal. These are the two people that I want you to be aware of. And with that, inshallah, we'll continue another day. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
فيا ذلي ويا خجلي إذا ما قال لي ربي أما استحييته تعصيني ولا تخشى من العتب وتخفي الذنب عن خلقي وتأبى في الهوى قربي فتب مما جنيت عسى تعود إلى رضا